Hello everyone, I'm back with another 2022 Class A 1v1 deck championship qualifier because I just finished Qualifier 2 a couple days ago. So for this one we had another 12 decks coming in, and once again the top 2 decks qualify to the Class A championship to be facing against some of these already seeded in decks. The next couple decks underneath that go in as wildcard options, which I may put in the championship depending on how big a field I want to have. So here, for this qualifier, I'm going to start with the decks that got knocked out earliest and talk about how they did, what went right and wrong with some of the different decks. I'm going to start with Wizard Fairies. I don't know what I was thinking when I came up with this deck. Both of these two factions have high uptime, important titans, so they're not going to work well together. On top of that, while Fairies can interact with opposing minions, it's purely in the sense of debuffing them rather than doing much else. Yes, they do have one bounce with Titania, but Titania is a card that you'd better be winning a base with anyway. And Wizards do some of the same things that Fairies like to do with the extra actions and card draw. The problem is Wizards aren't really a huge burst faction for the most part. They're really a support faction that makes your other faction work better. And so we've got Fairies trying to act as a carry. And yeah, in 4 straight games that failed to work. The second round they faced Elder Critters, and that should be a good matchup for most Wizards deck because extra actions into Madness Spam tends to be good. But Wizard Fairy still lost that one 2-0. Sumo Horses, we saw Sumo Orcs in the previous qualifier do pretty well, winning all 4 of its first games and then get shut down, losing its last 4 games instead. Sumo Horses it constantly felt like it was a little bit too slow to get anywhere, and it's not good enough at acting fast. It leaves too much stuff in play, takes too long to get stuff done. While it has the ability to play multiple minions in a turn with horses, when it comes to playing with Sumo, I just don't think horses do that as well as some other factions like even Shield would do. They didn't work well together. And Ignoble Apes is actually a good deck. What happened to them is they drew with the Avenging Knights, and then they had to play against Exploring Princesses. And if we take a look at the end of this and see which 2 decks are in blue for having qualified automatically with the top 2 spots, yeah, that was Ignoble Apes pairing. Ignoble Apes actually is a good deck, especially in a 3-player game, because the Ignobles tend to be a little bit all finesse with the fancy stuff they're doing. The Apes are all face-first SM Orc way of, I need to build a big stack and make that stack win the game. Just so happens that situations that Ignobles can't handle, the Apes can, and vice versa. However, their pairings got them knocked out. Kaiju Dragons. I talk a lot about Dragons being a big deal in Class A. There's a lot of Dragons decks that are already qualified in here. And there's also a lot of Dragons decks that are in these qualifiers, primarily because those decks didn't quite have a high enough rating on my rating list to be pre-seeded into the championship, but they had a high enough rating that they were some of the first decks I stuck in the qualifiers. In this case, Kaiju Dragon seems to work okay together, but it's just not quite championship status in this tier. Kaiju are a little bit vulnerable to getting rushed because they're very dependent on keeping their Titan in play over a couple turns in order to draw enough cards to snowball and then steamroll the opponent. Dragons are great at slowing down the game a little bit against opponents most of the time, but when you play fast enough to crash through the Dragons, you're also playing fast enough to crash through the Kaiju, and so both of these factions can lose to the same stuff from the opposing decks. In this case, Kaiju Dragons destroyed the Wizard Fairies, then they came up against Teddy Zombies, and they were able to win one of 2 games by using Dragons be good against rush decks that use lots of minions and being able to ignore Kaiju as a destruction faction, and zombies do well against destruction factions. But then they had to play the Astronite Kitties, and Imperial Dragon does not like dealing with kitty cats. Kitty cats steal the Imperial Dragon, kill it, and dragons without their Imperial have a hard time. On top of that, Astronites support the kitties with just enough card draw and other good things that the Astronites can do, that the kitties were able to consistently get their hands on Cat's Paw, or be able to figure out how to give a -2 to a minion when they needed it in order to steal it. So they were also able to deal with Great Worm pretty consistently. They were able to say, we play a slow game better than you, Dragons deck, so you're going to have to push. And some of the seeded Dragons decks in here are things like Astronite Dragons or Zombie Dragons, where the second faction has an ability to push. So if they end up running into a Kitty Cats deck, the Dragon deck can attempt to play aggro as at least part of its plan. Kaiju Dragons can't really go aggro. Kaiju doesn't have an extra gear to kick into. So as a result, the Astronite Kitties, while the score looks close, the games really weren't. And at that point, the Dragons were already eliminated, but they did manage to take a game off the Elf Sharks and hold the Elf Sharks to 5-3, despite the fact that Dragons have a bad matchup against Elves due to Elves being good at targeting 3-power minions and Imperial Dragon being a big deal. Kaiju matches up pretty well against Elves and also helps the Dragons develop against an opposing deck like Elf Sharks that relies very much on removal. The fact that Kaiju doesn't get stopped by minion removal allowed Kaiju Dragons to actually steamroll the second game of this match. So in the end, Kaiju Dragons finished 4-4, and they did decently. But decently isn't good enough to make the championship. Elder Critters. You might notice that I screwed up their pairings. They really weren't supposed to play the same deck twice. As it is, they took out Wizard Fairies. Elder Critters is a good deck. They played in the qualifier for the Big Class S Championship last year. They're a good deck. Teddy Zombies was a little bit of a better deck. Elder Critters maybe could have qualified in a different field. They didn't have good enough matchups this time. MOE Shield. I think I put this deck in because it did decent in some 3-player games. It was okay. Nothing special. It won some games by having Shield break some bases and get some points early. Shield did an early rush, and then the MOE scaling minions became overpowered when they hit 8 or 12 victory points. But ultimately, 2 wins and 4 losses was not getting them there. And that leaves us with one more deck that got eliminated in the third round, and that is the Steam Tricksters. Steam Tricksters took a game off exploring princesses in the first round, which I thought was very impressive, despite the fact that they were lucky as a son of a... I have no idea if that would decrease... Saying the last word would decrease my advertising likelihood at all. But in any case, they were lucky. First round, they played their Titan and take the shinies. Second round, they played a minion and scrap dove back their take the shinies. Third round, they played take the shinies again. Exploring Princesses never recovered. And that was how Steam Trickster was able to steal a game from what's probably a much better deck. When Tricksters get that golden opening hand, Spies can do the same thing. The discards cripple the opposing deck too much. And it's actually, seeing Tricksters do that a few times tells you why we haven't seen a lot more decks showing up in Smash Up, a lot more factions showing up that force their opponent to discard cards frequently. Discarding is either not that effective when the opponent has a lot of cards, or it's just completely crippling and the opponent doesn't really get to play the game. Second round, Steam Tricksters also drew with the Avenging Knights, and again, they ran through the same gauntlet that Ignoble Apes ran through, but Steam Tricksters managed to go 2-2 instead of 1-3, and so they got to keep going. And then they got knocked out with sort of Steampunk is a little bit unreliable, even though it's pretty strong. They had one bad game against Ignoble Apes, which is also a good deck. Ended up at 3-3, out of the running. But they are a good deck, and they were a fun deck to play. And finally, we get to the decks that actually we may be seeing in the championship. AK Kitties and Elf Sharks both had a shot at making it to 6-2 and did not manage to make it there. But I have to say I really enjoy playing both decks, and them being here kind of makes me want to extend the number of wild cards that get in far enough to maybe pick up the Elf Sharks. Elf Sharks are sort of a double destruction deck, even though elves aren't really destruction, that use elf card draw with Mako functioning as an extra play, and sharks also have Blood in the Water, although I found that elf sharks rarely have time to play and use Blood in the Water correctly. But they combine the shark extra plays with elf draw, and then they combine elf minion steal with shark removal. That shark removal tends to hit even-numbered minion powers. Elves are hitting odd numbers. And on top of that, they throw the elf specials. And they have a deck that says, if you're just playing a couple cards per turn and your cards aren't like 5 power or bigger, you are going to get controlled, and the elf sharks will eventually end up with more power in play than you have. They're a fun deck. Astronaut Kitties looked like they were a shoo-in at being the only deck at 5-1 after 3 rounds, and then their pairings put them up against the Avenging Knights. And the problem is Kitty Cats really need to be able to target 3-power minions, and Avenging Knights don't have any. So they lost due to a very bad counter pairing in the last round. There are not that many different factions that could have combined to create a deck that didn't give the Kitty Cats any targets without either debuffing them or using Cat's Paw. But the Astronaut Kitties went down to that. Now, as a deck, Astronauts support Kitties quite well. Kitties, similarly to Fairies, do a great job of controlling the board but struggle to break bases. Astronauts have a lot of tools that are pretty good at helping them break bases, and they also have enough draw tools and a couple of sift tools for helping draw the right cards that they can help the Kitty Cats or whatever other partner they're playing with some consistency as well. The combination happens to be very good against everything except this one unlucky random counter that they ran into. Their other lost game was against Elf Sharks, the other deck that finished on 5-3. Making a draw against Elf Sharks is not terribly bad. Losing to Avenging Knights hurt a little more. Speaking of Avenging Knights, who finished second in this tournament, you might notice that Fairy Avengers won the previous qualifier. Avengers are very good in my Marvel Elimination bracket. Last year, I had to do a bunch of changing around pairings. Every one of these decks in here included at least one Marvel faction. I kept having to change pairings in order to avoid Avengers decks playing each other, because the Avengers decks kept winning. Here, the Avengers are also continuing to win. I played Avenging Knights a little bit better every match than the previous match. It takes a little bit of doing to avoid running into situations where you expose your Knights to bad base breaks. Knights are pretty good, but I think they're a little bit partner dependent in 1v1. The problem is they tend to be a slow and steady build-up faction that builds up with its power in play. This is great in multiplayer games. In 1v1, it makes you a target for burst factions to try to pick which of your cards they take out of play with base breaks. But they do have a mechanic to help fight against this, and that is that they want to move around a lot. Yeah, the fact also that they tend to gain power counters also makes them even more vulnerable than just a bunch of moving around 4-power minions to targeted base breaks. Polynesians share the same weakness, but Knights, I believe, are a better faction than Polynesians in 1v1. And so it takes a fair amount of finesse to figure out what is a dangerous position, what is not a dangerous position, which of my knights can I afford to get discarded out of play. Let's make sure that that is the knight that's on the most vulnerable base to getting broken out of play so that I can keep the other stuff. And also one of those things is in a two-player game, you almost always have a better action to play than Questing Beast because Questing Beast can sometimes actually get you in trouble. As it so happens, like, by the end of their 6-2 run in this tournament, I was scoring the Grail successfully most games. The Knights, because they have some cards that operate off minions of power 4 or more, I think the Knights do well, probably with just about any faction that involves a bunch of minions of power 4 or more. Whether it be Princesses, Avengers, superheroes, with the caveat that superheroes are a bad faction, or Vigilantes. Although my caveat for Vigilante Knights is that when all your minions are 4 power, I think you have a little bit less tactical flexibility than when you can choose whether to play a 4 or 5 power minion. But in any case, Avenging Knights, while they started out with a bunch of draws because they were getting burst by finesse-type decks, they made this 6-2 record that they needed to advance. I think they're a good deck. They're going to be one of the better Knights decks, and of course they have Avengers, so they're always going to be at least pretty good. Final deck is Exploring Princesses, who barely won this qualifier by a 1-win difference in their strength of schedule. The number 1 seed in the Class A Championship is the Exploring Avengers, who also finished... Where are they here? Come on. There we go. Who also finished 11th in my overall 1v1 championship last year. And Exploring Princesses, they're Exploring Avengers with a different 5-power faction. They are not as good as Exploring Avengers, I'm pretty sure. I think Exploring Avengers have more reliable tools for reshuffling because more of the Princesses' faction power is tied up in their movement action skills, whereas more of the Avengers' faction power comes from the actual minions themselves. And that means that the Avengers can afford to... The Avengers give up less in terms of what they're doing this turn in order to play Avengers Assemble than the Princesses might be giving up this turn in order to play direct-to-DVD sequel. But still, Princesses are still a good faction, even if not quite as good as Avengers, and Exploring Princesses use the same nasty stunts of dropping 5-power minions in play as a new base comes into play, moving stuff around, and doing generally nasty things. I think the Exploring Princesses also suffer a little bit from the fact that movement is very powerful on turns and in positions where movement is very powerful. And when movement is not powerful, you want to have cards that do things other than move things around. And the Princesses and Explorers each individually have enough movement without adding the second faction. So they're losing the synergy of Avengers having maybe a more appropriate slate of actions to pair with Explorers, but still, when you pair Explorers with a bunch of 5-power bodies, you're going to get a good deck, and in this case, Exploring Princesses were good enough to win my second Class A qualifier, and they will be playing in the Class A Championship later on this year. So next video is going to be, surprise, surprise, the third qualifier, and actually I can fill in the first game result. A bit of a preview for this. Inca Wizard. Inca started out looking really hot when I first started playing them, and then they started doing worse. What I figured out about Inca is that similar to Kaiju, they have an attack that is very hard to stop. Kaiju have a weakness to burst and bring some removal. Inca are not bringing removal. Inca instead struggle to shift into a higher gear if they want to. They have their armories to add a bunch of power, but for the most part, they end up going with a slow and steady power buildup that just happens to be hard to stop with removal. Wizards help short-circuit their slow and steady part, because Wizards bring enough extra actions and an extra 4 to 5 power burst off of dropping their Titan, and that allows Inca to do things like play 2 Armories in one turn, or play a Fortress Walls, and then follow it up with playing enough additional actions on bases in order to make enough power in one turn to actually make Fortress Walls start to look like a burst card. So that's why I think Wizard Inca might be one of the better Inca decks. In their first game against Greek Kree, Greek Kree had a similar type of synergy to Wizard Inca. Both decks are pretty incapable of interacting with the opponent's cards, but they're both... Greek Kree, both of their factions are pretty aggressive factions. Greeks, I feel like, can use a little bit less sustain and more burst in most of their games. Kree sort of balance this out by bringing more burst, and the idea with the two things is you just want to use these two factions together and rush your opponent down. Both of these factions were able to get both of these decks were able to get a rush down going in the first game, and it just came down to first player advantage because by the late game, both decks were breaking a base every turn. I kind of expect they're going to draw, and then both decks will do decently in future rounds. Ant Pirates. We all know Ant Pirates. They make a giant first mate. They're a bit of a casino gaming deck because it's a question of do you draw first mates and get the counters on them fast enough. Kitty Cowboys. I have a feeling after having seen what happened to Kaiju Cowboys in the first qualifier, the Kitty Cowboys are also going to get beat up. But Zombie Critters might be a good deck. Critters often have enough burst that you have to take some pretty good defensive positions to stop them from breaking bases on you. Zombies, I think, might kick them over the edge and add some sustain. Notice at this point, between Wizard Inc. and Greek Kree and Zombie Critters, I've got 3 straight-up Rush decks coming out here. Russian Ignobles, let's see how they do. They might be great. Werewolf MOE, well, that's a control deck, for sure. It will have burst from the Werewolf Titan, at least. Grim Troopers, I think I've heard good things about. Sumo Mages, I think they resemble Sumo Orcs more closely than Sumo Horses. In the sense that the mages are actually going to work with the sumo cards. We'll see. I don't know how well mage card draw will work with sumo card draw. If I'm able to make the two sets of card draw work together, they'll be a great deck, or at least a pretty good one. If I can't, they're going to look pretty bad. Samurai Hydra is a decent deck with some obvious synergy, because Samurai give you some 2 powers that you want to kill. Dragon Knights might just be fantastic. It works here on the principle that Knights are a little vulnerable to getting rushed, so we're going to bring dragons to try to stop them from getting rushed, or at least punish the opponent for rushing them. Now, you recall that combination was not quite good enough with Kaiju Dragons, but with Dragon Knights, the dragons are actually providing minus power to the opponent, as well as just dropping their own power in play. So the dragons might be a little harder to crack than Kaiju was. So that's a quick preview of Qualifier 3. If you've got some predictions for who you think will come out winning Qualifier 3, feel free to stick them in the comments. Otherwise, I will be back next video with the results of Qualifier 3 and possibly some predictions for Qualifier 4. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy smashing.